Good morning, folks. I'm Tom McLaughlin, and opposite me is William Marvel, who is a Civil War historian with an article in the latest Civil War Times. And I've forgotten already what that man's name is.
Joseph Holt.
Joseph Holt, who was an associate of former Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and who was a real political firebrand of that time. And so I invited Bill, who is also the Tuesday columnist of at the Conway Daily Sun. I'm the Thursday columnist most of the time. And private joke there. I'm concerned about what's happening in our country. And I have been on the left when I was a younger man. Now I'm on the right. And I see the division between left and right. This is not a show for the usual left and right, although it might emerge as that. And I see those divisions increasing, and I'm concerned. And you know, other pundits have suggested that we're on the verge of civil war. I hope they're wrong, but I wanted to explore the question. So I could, you know, having an acquaintance with Bill and knowing of his work, I thought I would ask him the essential question, and I emailed him. I think I've worded it this way. Do you see parallels between the United States today, political divisions here in the United States, and those divisions that existed in 1860? So, Bill, do you see such parallels?
Well, in many ways I do. There is certainly the same sort of polarization, fragmentation among the major parties, hostility for opposing viewpoints. And I remember just a few months after the election having a discussion with Ernie Brown, an artist friend of mine at the dump, about whether we are more divided now than we have been since the Civil War. And my conclusion is that we are as divided now. Whether it will lead to the same thing, I doubt.
Oh, good. Okay.
But that's only because the divisions are among communities, not between communities. The geographic cohesiveness of the slave issue allowed for regional contest, and although we have certainly regional political differences, I don't think it's sufficiently universal to create an actual civil war. But certainly the seeds of societal and governmental dissolution are there through simple fragmentation and hostility toward government, depending on who's in charge.
So many thoughts went through my mind as you were talking, and I remember seeing lead-ups to films on the Civil War or documentaries especially, which would say it was father against son, brother against brother. Well, today's divisions have affected my family, both my immediate family and my extended family of origin. We don't bring it up now and get together for, you know, a holiday, and it's verboten to discuss politics. Mm-hmm. And this, you know, the symbol of this division would be feelings about our president, and so we tend not just don't go there because it's much more emotional than it ever was. And I come from a political family. We've been political for you know, since we were little kids, passing out flyers, putting them on the windshields at shopping centers and such, usually for local issues and such. And so we've always been comfortable discussing political matters. But now we just don't, because it would threaten our relationships. And it's so there's that. You have something to say about that? Or?
Well, I've had similar experiences. I don't have much of a family, very small, and all of my older relatives are gone now, and yet I've had certainly virtually altercations with friends with whom I used to be in political concert. And even at home, we're tired of, it's not so much a matter of hostility, but we're just kind of tired of going over the same ground.
Yeah.
I know my wife is tired of hearing of me talk about it, and I tire of talking about it. But I have noticed that out in in-law country in Kansas, among the Christian fundamentalists who are my only extended family, I, the family atheist, seem to be more welcome than I, the political iconoclast, am here in my own community.
Well, as I said, I used to be on the left and pretty far out there when I was a young man, and now I'm you could say a stereotypical conservative. I tend to line up with what most people understand a conservative to be on almost every issue. And yet, Bill, I would say he is eclectic. I don't know where to put Bill. If somebody asked me where is he on the political spectrum, I'll say, well, he's over here, and he's over here, and he's over here, and he's over there, and the various issues that we've ever discussed or I've read your writings about. And so that made me even more curious about what your opinion would be about this question.
Well, much like you, I used to consider myself a liberal, and people consider me conservative more often now. Yet I don't feel as though I've changed much. To me, it's society that, in moving much farther to the left, society has made me look more conservative. I remember in 1973 walking down Boylston Street and seeing the Now banner over the office on Boylston Street and thinking, well, it's about time. I mean, even
the Office of National Organization for Women?
Right.
Okay.
Because I remember even as a child asking my mother why women have to change their names when they get married. It seemed to me that there was a little too much rigidity and male domination. But as with many movements, and maybe all movements for equality, I've found that the aim may be equality in many people's hearts at the outset, but the result often seems to be a campaign for reversing the political domination. And that certainly seems to be the case today. And so in the face of that, then I would certainly seem conservative.
60% of undergraduate degrees are granted to women these days, about 60% of master's degrees, and now they've even tipped the scales on PhDs as well. There are more of them granted to women. And as a former public school teacher, I can say that they tended to be better students. And I had a 36-year teaching career, and I noticed that the academic academic achievement of boys was steadily declining on average, and that of girls has always been fairly strong. I mean, they tend to be more studious, they tend to be more responsible, but yet males have been on the decline, as reflected in the statistics I just offered you about post-secondary education. Something you said earlier, however, about that the Confederate States were contiguous and they seceded at the same time. Then you had border states which did not secede, but and you said that kind of a geographic layout doesn't exist today, and today's divisions are not reflected that way. What came into my mind was the Bolshevik Revolution, and could you call that a civil war? I think you could.
Well, there was a Russian Civil War in the midst of that revolution.
Yes, and that was very definitely a left-right kind of a conflict, and it wasn't. There were certain pockets of resistance that were more in one place than another on each side, but it was pretty much spread out over the whole country. And the fighting, they did have a civil war immediately afterward, the Reds and the Whites, and it didn't resolve itself until sometime in the 20s, when Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky managed to consolidate power. Then they fought amongst themselves a little bit, Stalin and Trotsky, but there was, it was pretty much ideological then, and something like that. Do you see that kind of a possibility?
Well,
here?
We have certainly a lot of mob violence now, almost entirely on the left. We have Democratic congressmen and women, particularly women, Maxine Waters, I think, who are basically inciting violence. So that's sort of an economic uprising, particularly among urban masses, is possible. But whether that would lead to bloodshed, I don't know, because, well, New York certainly has strict gun laws, and I don't know if the revolution could succeed on 6-round magazines. But you would have to have some sort of armed conflict to probably spark the Civil War. That might come from outside. Oftentimes, when individual nations are divided between themselves, neighbors or rivals will take advantage of that. That often creates an international conflict that then foments an internal rebellion. But the emotional impetus for that is certainly there.
There was a left-wing agitator who opened fire on Republican congressmen at a baseball practice. The Republicans against the Democrats. I think it was limited to the House, or maybe it was all congressmen. But Republican Congressman Steve Scalise was very severely wounded, almost died, and has been permanently crippled as a result of that. And if it weren't for Capitol Police, who happened to come to this outside of the metropolitan, well, somewhere in metropolitan D.C. anyway, a couple of cops managed to get the shooter before he was able to do more damage. But he was a sniper, and he was opening fire on Republicans, and he targeted Republicans specifically. And it turns out that he was had been a Bernie supporter, and he didn't get a whole lot of media after that. Once that died down, and
well, I certainly have noticed that that news that's adverse to the liberal agenda tends to be downplayed or ignored by liberal media. Is certainly highlighted by conservative media. But that's one of the problems, is I think that we don't have any real source of reliable information. And I don't trust organs like the Daily Caller, very conservative website, which often has, like Breitbart News, misleading headlines. And then when you read the text of the story, you realize that, oh, this was just a tease. This wasn't real. But neither do I trust the Washington Post or the New York Times, because even though they make an effort to report factually, that it isn't so much what they say about what they're reporting on as what they report. And oftentimes their bias is more evident in what they ignore than in what they report.
I see the
So
same thing.
I have a hard time finding any news outlet that I trust. And I'm kind of amused watching, particularly reading letters to the editor, to the local paper, when I see my friends of either a conservative or liberal persuasion coming out in response to a piece of news predictably, with their opinions clearly influenced by their political prejudices, not by rational thought. Whether it's someone, a knee-jerk supporter of Brett Kavanaugh, who is convinced by his refutation of the charges, which I have to say, what little I saw of it was convincing, or if it's liberal friends of mine who are just lining up waiting for his accuser to speak so they can say how credible she was, which I didn't think when I saw a few minutes of her testimony. I actually, in that case, I have to say that I was more persuaded by Kavanaugh than by her. And I could go into details of that, but details don't seem to be what people are concerned about. It's their feelings about the issue.
Exactly. I wrote about it this week. I couldn't not, and it's. I finished the column. I posted it to one newspaper, and I'll put it on my website probably later today. And it followed pretty much that there was emotion on both sides, and I had already formed an opinion before I listened to the testimony. I was open to it changing, but it didn't, and it was cemented. But the emotion involved. So had every senator on that panel.
Mm-hmm.
Had already declared where they were.
Yeah.
And so, what's the point of a hearing if But yet, it's to persuade, I guess. Hopefully, the general public to then put pressure on their elected representatives to vote this way or that way.
Sure.
And so it was a show.
Yes.
And so I was anxious to see. I didn't watch the Bork hearings in the 80s. I did watch the Clarence Thomas hearings when I could. I was teaching, but I had them on TV. I would have them on all day long because I had a TV in my room, and it was something I was responsible to teach, the U.S. Constitution. So here it is. This is the Senate functioning in its advice and consent role. And how do you think they're functioning? And we went into that a lot. Mm. So I watched all of the Clarence Thomas hearings. I had some things to do on Thursday, but I canceled them, and I watched that all day long. And I wanted to see it all. Last Thursday's hearings with Christine Blasey Ford, and then the testimony by Kavanaugh, and all the grandstanding by every senator up there, some of whom want to run for president, much like Edwin Stanton wanted to and did, I guess. And
no.
He never did run, but he wanted to.
And I don't think he wanted to. Edwin Stanton was so two-faced that I think he understood that he would have to take a position, and that too many people would recognize that he was dissembling. He never wanted to be president. He never wanted to run for elective office. He wanted a political...
Seward did, right? He was
Seward,
member
yes,
of the cabinet.
Seward was a rival to Lincoln in the...
And there were a few others in the cabinet as well, weren't there?
Well, Edward Bates was considered as a candidate, and I guess he sort of forwarded his name. I don't remember how far he got with that. Mostly the cabinet in those days was a balancing of state power. For instance, it was considered unseemly to have two cabinet members from the same state. But I'm
Okay.
detracting from your story there.
Yes, so
I
it was.
just had to jump on an inaccuracy.
It was emotional. I mean, there was way more emotion than there was rational thought exhibited that day, and it's and people would say, I feel like I believe this side, or I feel like I believe that side, and evidence as presented in in a due process courtroom proceeding just wasn't observed at all. Hardly. At least, they had a prosecutor there who was questioning, the Republicans had hired to question Christine Blasey Ford, and then they scrapped her, after a while. It was just too analytical. I think the Republicans, especially Lindsey Graham, first realized that, this is not a coldly rational kind of a process here. This is a very emotional process, and so we're losing in that particular scenario. So he just said, nope, I want to talk, and then he did in a very emotional way, uncharacteristic of him. He's a former JAG himself, and we were talking at breakfast about a Judge Advocate General back in the Civil War, and that's what Lindsey Graham had been. So he was a prosecutor and a judge and a defense lawyer, and as were many up there on that stand on both sides, and yet that kind of experience just it wasn't in evidence, as people played to the feelings of the audience and played to their side of knowing that how their constituencies or their left-right constituencies, that is, were seeing this, and so it was. I was disgusted, as were so many other people, with this. What's our country become, and the divisions that we're talking about were exemplified, very, very, very largely in that hearing, and it was dismaying to me, very dismaying.
Well, I didn't see much of it. As we discussed at breakfast, I shut my television off during the Lewinsky hearings before the Clinton impeachment process because I was disgusted with the path that the debate was taking. It seemed not to be substantive. At least during the Lewinsky hearings, we know that something actually happened. Now we don't even know that, unless you happen to be a Democrat, and then you know that something happened, I guess. So I don't have a television anymore. I haven't looked at television in 20 years. But I do have a computer, and I don't have very fast service, which is a good thing because that way I'm not distracted a lot. But I did watch a couple of clips, just a fragment of Kavanaugh's response after a moment of Ms. Ford's testimony. And I have to say that the only part I saw was when Dianne Feinstein asked in a very friendly fashion how she knew that it was Brett Kavanaugh who attacked her. And she launched into a very esoteric explanation of memory with a lot of medical jargon about the hippocampus and how memory works. During which she was smiling kind of sheepishly. That's the only evidence I had of, from facial expression. But what I saw was a woman who has a PhD in psychology who apparently is unaware of the concept of manufactured memory, who doesn't seem to understand that the same explanation she used to describe why she remembers Brett Kavanaugh should also perhaps imprint on her memory where it happened or about when it happened or something else about it. I mean, I can understand that none of the witnesses she named can remember anything about it because nothing happened to them. And if the two people she named as being in the room with her were there, I could understand why they would deny it. But then I saw a few minutes of Kavanaugh's testimony, and he seemed genuinely angry, as I would be if I had been falsely accused. I found it interesting that he didn't blame her, that he seems to believe, or at least to present the belief, that she's mistaken.
He blamed the Democrats up on the dais.
And so do I. As I read about the beginnings of this process, I also watched the first 20 seconds of the hearings. And I shut it off when Kamala Harris started harassing the chairman. I began with a sort of sympathy for the Democrats who were complaining that they'd been flooded with information at the last minute. I mean, that used to happen to us on the budget committee. The school board would inundate us with information always at the last minute, so we couldn't really effectively review it. So I was sympathetic to that, even though I was annoyed by the disruptive tactics of the Democrats. But the release of the accusations, the serial, sequential, kind of calculated, orchestrated release, spoke to me of strategy, not of indignation. And it reminded me of the Roy Moore election in Alabama, where, to my mind, there were plenty of reasons to vote against Roy Moore without that. But what could they come up with that would be effective? Accusations that you can't deny. Some of which may have been true in his case, for instance. But dating women 20 years younger than you is not unknown. I mean, look through the marriage records in the Conway Town Report from the 1960s and 70s. As for the attacks that were alleged, why weren't they brought up before? And the same is true here in the Kavanaugh case. The woman who claims that she attended parties where there were gang rapes, why didn't you report those?
Why did you keep going back? Well,
there's another question. I won't touch that one.
Okay.
But so in this case, I think the Republicans, and I'm amused that I find myself saying this, I think the Republicans have the high moral ground, at least as high as a politician in the United States today can go. And I'm sufficiently contemptuous of the tactics that the Democrats are using that for the first time in my adult life, I probably will not vote for a Democrat in this coming election. And I was a Democrat most of my life, and until very recently voted predominantly for Democrats. Voted for Obama twice. But I ran a column recently about accusations against a North Country Democrat here in New Hampshire, and I got sympathy from many people, including Democrats, including some who are running for office. And they said, yes, that he should be given the benefit of the doubt until he gets some sort of judicial review. And I'll tell you, unless those people come out publicly and denounce this process, they're not getting my vote this November.
What wasn't brought up at the hearing was infamous cases of false accusations, like the Duke Lacrosse team, which was brought up on charges. The whole many members of that team, half a dozen of them, I think.
One at the University of Virginia, I think.
Another
Rolling
one.
Stone did a story about it that they had to, I think, retract.
They did. And
Tawana Brawley, I remember.
And then there's that one. And so, I mean, there are plenty of cases in which there have been false accusations against men, sexual assault. And of not
course,
to say
you have to say though that there are also men who commit a sexual assault
are
going to deny it.
Yes, and but I expect that there are lots of women who have been sexually assaulted much in the way that Christina Blasey Ford described her assault. I mean, some guy has her alleged assault. It probably did happen at some point in her life, but I kind of have a hard time believing that the person that Kavanaugh did it. Anyway, the women have, probably a great many of them are unreported, and I've been hearing about them from women who I trust have, for the first time, this prompted them to say, well, something similar happened to me, and these women I believe, and it's so I expect there are millions of them who have had similar experiences,
and now many of them are not going to be believed because of this charade.
Could be. It's just not a good thing. Bringing it back though to the divisions in the country. I mean, yeah, there are women versus men, and Democrats who in the media portrays as championing women, and then the white men. We can't have white men interviewing questioning this victim of this female victim, and so they the optics were not good, and they needed to hire this other. One of the woman to question her and so forth, and so there are sexual divisions, and there are, certainly the political divisions. I think all the other divisions of race and sex and sexual preference and such as that are subsumed into political orientation. And all of those would tend to line up with Democrats, racial minorities and sexual minorities and such as them. And so isolated, just the Republican, all figures there'd be 11 white guys up there. Well, race was a big factor in the Civil War, and you had, I'm think of things that sparked it, like in one guy in particular, John Brown. I mean, in Bleeding Kansas, when he and his sons killed several pro-slavery people. And then, of course, the Harper's Ferry thing later, and he was hanged and so forth. So those helped to spark, violence in the Civil War, and especially Harper's Ferry. But is this shooting of the congressional Republicans? Antifa hasn't killed anybody, as far as I know. They have, wounded people. They come in and whack them with things, and so there are contusions and abrasions and lacerations and such as that, but no killings yet, and hopefully there won't be. I don't know. But Antifa comes loaded for bear at these places and wants to. They wear masks, and why would they wear masks? So, video cameras can't identify them later, and they can't be prosecuted for the illegal things they intend to do when they show up. And why cops even allow anyone to be there with a mask on? They shouldn't. I don't know if they can prevent it or not legally or not, but that concerns me.
It was my understanding that at least in New Hampshire and perhaps in other states, it was illegal to wear a disguise 10 or 15, 20 years ago.
Oh, that's interesting.
I don't know if that was ever enforced. How would you have a Halloween party? But I feel the same way about Antifa. The thing that has crossed my mind is that if they attack people in a state with reasonable gun laws, you would only be able to identify them by the bodies. But there is that violent factor. There was you sent me a link to a website, I don't know how reliable it is, that has I hope a fringe group of communists calling for political assassinations.
Associated with Antifa, they were.
Yes. Well, I guess I could believe that. There are fringe groups on the other extreme of the spectrum who have used violence. I don't know as they may well advocate it today. And those two groups came together at Charlottesville, and I watched clips of some of that, and it seemed that one side was as ready to fight as the other. And those sorts of extreme groups tend to expand in times of polarization because everyone has to back up behind somebody. You know, those of us who are left in the middle trying to sort the facts out can be pretty vulnerable.
Especially if the polarization continues and it starts to manifest in other ways that maybe aren't all violent, but lining up with, oh gosh, where am I going with this? Well, let's say, for example, University of California at Berkeley, when it would be a radical left university. I think it's safe to say that.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
That when conservatives, they do have some conservatives, the college Republicans or whatever it is they call themselves, invite speakers. Mm-hmm. And people like Ann Coulter, who is, a pistol, certainly a conservative woman. People like Ben Shapiro, who's a young, articulate conservative, and then a now discredited Milo Yiannopoulos, who was there for a while. But there were violent reactions to just their presence on campus. And they had to be canceled, some of those, except for the case of Shapiro. They did have, but with the presence of 400 cops that took to protect him so that he could finish his speaking engagement and leave safely. But the rest were canceled because they were violently shut out.
Well, and that sort of that violent squelching of dissent is perhaps the most dangerous part of this today. And the left is entirely to blame for that now. I'm glad to hear that Ben Shapiro got through what he had to say, even though I disagree with much of it. And I feel that probably now, although I don't know about Kavanaugh, how I would feel about him as a Supreme Court justice, I would say it's more important now that he be confirmed to discredit and disavow the process that's been used to try to destroy him. That's more important, I think, than whatever his rise to the Supreme Court might yield. I think that particular principle is more important now than the court itself, which I consider extremely important.
Some people think there's an apt comparison between the slavery issue in those days and the abortion issue today. Others say, no way, there's no comparison at all. However, slavery certainly was the primary issue in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Abortion was the primary issue in the Kavanaugh hearings and other fights, from Bork to Thomas to Kavanaugh himself. It's, preserve Roe v. Wade, and you had women dressed up as characters from The Handmaid's Tale, that, a movie about, men, white men are forcing women to have children and owning them and so forth. And I never saw the movie, I never read the book, but I have an idea that that's the plot. And, and then Christina Blasey Ford is one that is, Kavanaugh was trying to force her to have sex, this evil white guy. And so there are similarities, at least.
There are. If you want to make that comparison, I don't think abortion is as dominant an issue as slavery was, because it was not only humanitarian, it was economic. Most Northerners were opposed to slavery for its economic impact, and those Southerners who were opposed to it were opposed to it entirely because of its economic impact. The abortion issue is indicative, but I don't think equivalent. I did notice, certainly, that in in the Roy Moore case, Gloria Allred, who I think wasn't she the lawyer who
Represented one of the women at least, yes.
but wasn't she involved in Roe v. Wade? I think perhaps she was. Maybe I misread that because, as I say, I don't pay a lot of attention to it. But it could be that abortion is a signature issue of liberality, and that the aim is to find a liberal justice who, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, will make decisions based on political prejudice, liberal in general, not just on the subject of abortion. I mean, you and I obviously disagree on the subject of abortion. I'm fully in support of a woman's right to choose, but I'm also in support of a man's right to choose. I think if a woman, if a man and a woman are having a baby and he doesn't want it and she doesn't submit to abortion, then that's her right. But I think she also should lose the right to sue for child support and collect welfare. So it's not entirely a liberal issue with me. It's an issue of rights. But I do find it interesting, as much as I support the right to have an abortion, that those who are most concerned about that right of theirs are worried about it, because there's a poetic justice in that, the liberal left, having been so adamant in taking rights away from gun owners, for instance. So when their rights are threatened, they go ballistic. And I understand that, but I don't think they have to worry about that. I really don't think Roe versus Wade is going to be overturned. I think this is just an effort to quash a conservative viewpoint in general.
So here we're talking about a Supreme Court decision, 1973, Roe versus Wade, in which the federal government took away from the states their right to make abortion law. They said this is a constitutional right that women have, and states may not restrict it in any way. So that was a very controversial decision, clearly. But then there were other Supreme Court decisions in the 1850s, just prior to the Civil War, that were also incendiary and leading to the Civil War, like the Fugitive Slave Act, the Dred Scott Decision, and those. So that's another parallel here,
Well, the Dred Scott certainly was the among Supreme Court decisions that was inflammatory. I think the Fugitive Slave Act, part of the Compromise of 1850, was probably more important because it basically turned Northerners into slave catchers. But I'm kind of an iconoclast even in Civil War history, and I'm one of those who argues that if the Democrats had had the sense in 1860 not to divide, they probably would have won the election. Slavery would have gone on for quite a while longer. But I also think that if the North had allowed the South to go when they seceded, I think that slavery would have been ended eventually, because of the inability to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. After that, the South would have been restricted, and those slaves escaping would be gone forever. And more important, as an independent nation, slavery would have been an entirely national issue. That was why we had the Civil War. It wasn't a national issue, it was a regional issue. It pitted one region against another. Every other nation that ended slavery peacefully, and they all did, except those that still have it, mostly in Africa, they ended it because it was an economic problem that faced everyone in the nation. So,
forcing the North to become citizens up north, law enforcement officials to become slave catchers, which went against their their moral beliefs.
Yes.
Then something similar happening with abortion, for example. And it came up in the Kavanaugh hearings, not Thursday, but prior.
Mm-hmm.
And it had to do with isn't some methods of birth control also abortion-inducing drugs? And you know, for a Catholic like Kavanaugh and myself, then, you know, when does life begin is the question. And legally under Roe v. Wade, it begins that a human being is a human being only when he or she has completely cleared the birth canal, but not prior to. Well, we believe it starts in conception. So, if, you know, when conception occurs, oops, I better shut that off before it rings. When conception occurs, then, you know, the blastocyst, fetus, whatever you want to call it, baby, hasn't attached to the uterine wall. And so some abortion-inducing drugs will prevent that from happening. So, you know, a Catholic would believe, and some other non-Catholics and so forth would believe that, yeah, okay, then there's a human life already formed, and then it's flushed, you know, with this drug. So that, whether you believe that or not, is not important. But there are other abortions, you know, being a constitutional right after Roe v. Wade, and Democrats are trying to get state funding for abortions, and they're trying to, you know, get more hospitals to do them, and also to force nurses to assist in an abortion when they think there's a murder taking place. And so that's not unlike what, you know, Northerners would have, you know, being forced to arrest fugitive slaves, you know, would be like. And so I have two nurses in my family, and my daughters, and others. My sister is one, a nurse practitioner now, and another physician, and they are all, you know, strongly pro-life, and, you know, out in dread, you know, the time when they're forced to say, no, I'm not going to assist in this. So it's an issue.
Well, it is, and I understand that. Although I was raised Catholic. I'm 3/4 Irish and 1/8 French. So Catholicism was fairly heavy in my household. But in my household, life, at least according to my father, began either when you're 21 or you join the Navy, or until you can whip me, which in my case didn't happen until he was 60 or so. But I don't have that concern about abortion that you do, but I understand the concept. I understand the concept of people who object to being forced to either go out of business or take part in gay marriages. I mean, someone said to me when I threw that up as a possibility back before the Supreme Court decided that gay marriage was encrusted in the Constitution, that people would be forced to violate their religious beliefs in that regard. And I can picture the person saying, that's never going to happen. That was the first thing that happened. So conflicts like that have to be resolved somehow. And either you can just accept that people don't want to take part in it, or you can force them to and create animosity and hostility, and that seems to be the avenue people take today. That's the avenue people took in the 1850s. John Brown's a good example of that. He is credited with having brought it to the fore to a crisis point where after his day, almost any incident could be the tipping point, the flash point for conflict. But he and earlier abolitionists also helped to worsen slavery by increasing restrictions on slaves. In many states, it also increased restrictions on all other people. In many southern states, if not all, it became illegal to mail any information that favored abolition, any arguments in favor of abolition. Southerners who were opposed to slavery had to basically head north or face a lynching of their own in many cases, except for Cassius Clay. He built himself an arsenal outside Lexington and published an abolition newspaper in the middle of Kentucky and bought himself some cannon. And
I never heard of that Cassius Clay.
well, he's the one that the boxer was named after. He was a cousin of Henry Clay. And during the Civil War, he became minister to Russia. Lincoln appointed him minister to Russia. He was a Republican from Kentucky and was a brigadier general during the Civil War. And late in life, he married a 16-year-old girl, and there were those who claimed that he had coerced her into coming out to his plantation. So the sheriff and about 19 deputies went out to get him, and he lit up his cannon and started firing at them, and the sheriff came back and reported to the prosecutor, we couldn't take him. Problem was we didn't take enough men. And then he gave his wife the opportunity to leave if she wanted to, and I don't remember if she did or not. He was quite a character, but he was a Kentucky abolitionist in the middle of a slave state.
I'd be more proud of that name than I would be Muhammad Ali, I guess, but that's his job, his business.
Well, that's why he was named Cassius Clay.
Interesting. Well, I had one more thing I was going to bring up. You said that, before I get to our producer's question.
Oh, yes.
And that was when you said that it was the movement against slavery and for slavery, at least, those who supported it and those who opposed it tended to be more economic than it was moral or religious. But religion, Christianity, played a role in the anti-slavery movement and also in the anti-abortion movement. So another parallel, that's all.
Well, it also played a part in the slavery movement. I mean, the Southern Methodists became Southern Methodists because they disagreed with the Northern Methodists' interpretation of the Bible in relation to slavery.
And the Northern Methodists used the Bible to say that slavery was wrong?
Yes, and Southerners believed otherwise. And as is always the case, you can use either the Bible or statistics to prove anything you wish.
Yes, you can. Okay, our producer has given us a question here. We haven't seen it before, and I'm sure it's on the subject. Have political commentators and pundits contributed to the divisions in our country?
Certainly, because each faction has its cadre of them. I don't know if that's...
That fits. In my mind, it does.
I don't take that personally, although perhaps it was meant that way.
Okay, yeah.
But I at least attempt to inject what I consider reason into arguments, along with a little humor sometimes. It's more and more difficult to find humor. It's also more and more difficult to find media that will really allow independent thought. There are verboten issues, there are verboten opinions.
There are, and yes, a resounding yes, that, how does he word it here? Political commentators and pundits have contributed to divisions in our country, present company excluded, of course.
Well, that laugh, I think, gives us our answer.
Yes. I have tried to stir the pot at times. I don't so much do that anymore, but early in my columnist writing career, I found it fun to tease people on the other side, and I'd be going along writing, and I'd be on a particular paragraph making a point, and I thought of an incendiary word would pop itself into my brain, and I'm thinking, Now, that wouldn't be prudent to use that word in this place, but it would probably get a reaction from so-and-so, so boom, I'd type it out and I'd put it in there. So yeah, I did try to, prod the other side, knowing I'd get a reaction. I was seldom disappointed, and I enjoyed that sort of thing. I don't do that now, really. I try not to. You may think I do, and others may think I do, but it's a sincere belief if I do it, and it's not an intentional prod that I would otherwise have made.
I'm always interested when letters to the editor about me, or especially about you, take the tone of "How dare you think that way?" instead of "Why do you think that way?"
Yeah. And it's most often the former than the latter. I mean, occasionally you get something reasoned, and those are the ones I pay attention to, and or especially if I got something wrong. I mean, something factually wrong, which I have done at least twice. And
Is that all?
Well,
I certainly you're doing better than I.
Well, when it was pointed out to me
I
in
see.
a letter to the editor. And I don't respond to them, letters to the editor, pro or con. And I think it's a good way to be. But I, at least in print, I mean, in a future column I may refer to it obliquely, but not by name. And then it's, well, I don't know where I was going with that now. I've forgotten. It's my aging brain. But this political, the media, and you talked about the media is biased. I mean, most people get the television news. Most people get their news from television, and the audience for those networks that I would consider to be biased to the left would be ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, MSNBC. And their audience taken together, and Fox News over here, it would be about 90-10 comparison. The viewership is that much of a discrepancy. So overwhelmingly, the media that most Americans get their news from is biased to the left. And
well, as Mark Garang mentioned in a former I won't say confrontation, meeting with you here. That may be because journalists tend to be more educated. I don't know if that's the case. I consider myself fairly educated, although my wife is more so than I, and she is more liberal than I am, and the same is true of our favorite millennial. But there have been some fairly educated conservatives. William Buckley comes to mind, and I don't know. I don't ascribe it to education. Oftentimes, I ascribe
that is degrees earned.
Yeah, right. My own education, I suspect, is more self-inflicted.
Yes,
Than
so has mine. I mean, I have some degrees, but it's that's not where I got my
When
knowledge.
I went to college and read my reading lists, half of the books I had already read in the year and a half I was living in Boston and living out of the Boston Public Library and the Widener Library at Harvard. Yeah,
degrees only convince some other people that maybe you know something, but they don't convince me that the holder of them is either informed or even intelligent.
That's probably why Christine Blasey Ford
Whatever
is Dr. Ford.
Yes, could be. We have very little time left. Is there anything
I was
that
hoping for another 20 years or so.
Well, I hope you make it, and us white guys are supposed to make it to about 79 point something. So
I see.
If I make it to 80, I'll feel like, okay, well, at least I got what was coming to me. And that means that's only 13 more years in my case.
Lord.
Yeah.
You better get busy then.
Get busy with what?
whatever you're doing.
Whatever it is
That's
I
what
want to get
that's
done.
what I
My
think.
bucket list, you mean?
I look at my life as how many books I've got left in me.
I see. How many are you going to write, huh? And that's what, 20 now?
No,
You've already published.
18 is coming out in November.
Number
I'm working
18.
on 19 now.
All right.
There are some I don't count that I just edited.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, congratulations to you. I mean, that's a legacy.
It is, and that and $1.95 will get me a cup of coffee. By the way, thank you for breakfast.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure. So maybe we can do this again around some other subject. I hope you'll be open to it as you were this time.
We'll see.
Thank you, Bill Marvel.